Welcome to a Genesis Project podcast on assessment and progression. This podcast will deal with OffBooks students, Erasmus in and out students, students with ZeroGrades, and module grades for special student cases. One of the functions of the new student system, SITS eVision, is assessment and progression of students. This podcast will deal with the following: OffBooks students, Erasmus in and out students, students with ZeroGrades, and module grades for special cases PD, AOR, DS, SP and POR. First log into my.tcd.ie and go to the assessment menu item. Let's look at OffBooks students first. Only enter marks for those assessment components that the student has completed this academic year. All other components should receive a 0 mark and a grade of NA. In the example below, the student completed the term test in a previous academic year, so for this academic year they receive a mark of 0 and a grade of NA. With the marketing case study, which is grade only, the student also receives NA. For the exam, however, the student completed the exam in this academic year and receives the marks awarded in this academic year. So the student gets 65 for their mark for this year and a grade of pass. Once the rest of the students' results have been inputted and the module results calculated, you can then finalize the module results. The students' overall module results are calculated outside of SITS, taking into account the components that were assessed in a previous academic year. Now click on the Finalize Module Results button and then Finalize. Click on the Copy All button to copy over the marks. Our particular student completed both the term test and the marketing case study in a previous academic year. For the term test, the student achieved 75. This leads to an overall calculated final mark of 67 and a final grade of a 2-1 when calculated outside of the SITS system. A note should be put in to that effect. Once again, our student completed these components in a previous academic year, so the marks entered should be 0 and the grades NA. The student completed the exam in this academic year, so the mark achieved was 65%. An overall final mark was calculated outside of SITS, taking into account the term test and the marketing case study that the student sat in the previous year. This gave a final grade of a 2-1. Do not click on the Calculate button. If you do, the previous components and marks of 0 will be taken into account. Then enter a note explaining why the results were changed and click on the Continue and Confirm button until the results have been successfully agreed. Let's now look at Erasmus in and out students. For Erasmus out students, these students shouldn't appear on the student lists in SITS. They shouldn't be registered against the module in CMAS. So no provision has to be made for these students in SITS. For Erasmus in students, for module mark entry, these students should have the module marks entered against the assessment components that they took in this academic year. So just treat them like any other student when entering module marks. However, for Erasmus in students, for progression, These students have a special course code starting with UV. This course will not appear on the Court of Examiners report, nor do they have to be progressed in SITS. So there is no progression in SITS for Erasmus in students. SITS requires a grade or mark for every student, even those who do not attend an exam or do not complete an assessment. Therefore, a number of grades have been set up in the component mark schemes to deal with these special student cases. SITS will automatically assign a grade of A, B or absent to a grade of 0. It's very unusual that a student remains on this grade. The vast majority of absences are explained. Another grade is awarded to the component and to the module. The grades of PD and AOR can only be awarded following approval by the suitable authority, such as the Senior Lecturer or Dean of Graduate Studies. With permission to defer, or PD, the student was absent from an exam or test or failed to submit an assessment, but is provided an acceptable explanation and be given permission to defer. The attempt number in SITS for this student will not be incremented. When the student is reassessed, it is viewed as if it is their first sitting of this exam or the first time they have resubmitted their assessment component. AOR is absent but will be reassessed. So the student will be reassessed at the next scheduled exam session for that course year. The attempt number in SITS will be incremented. It's viewed as the student's second attempt. As we saw earlier, NA is not assessable. It was not possible to assess the student in this component. For example, a one-term visiting student who is not a TCT for the annual exam, or an OffBooks student where they receive NA for components that were not assessed in this academic year. A full and comprehensive explanation of marks for ZeroGrades is available on the Genesis Project website under how to enter and finalise marks for a module section. So when should I use DS, defer to special examinations, and SP, special examinations, instead of PD? PD, permission to defer, is used normally. This is the normal situation. DS, defer to special examinations, and SP, special examinations, should only be used where there are no scheduled supplementals and permission has been given to do so by the suitable authority. In the example shown here, the student has failed one or more assessment components and has achieved a final grade of F1. The student has been given permission to defer by the senior lecturer, but if I try and change the final grade to DS, defer to supplemental, SITS will return an error. SITS has returned an error as reassessment items have already been set up for each of the assessment components, so there is no need to use DS. PD, or permission to defer, should be used, and this is the normal situation. DS is only used where no reassessment items have been set up. I click Continue. And confirm. The student result has now been agreed successfully. What about PR, passed but would be reassessed? In this particular case, the student has been assessed, passed the component or module, but has been given permission to be reassessed in order to improve his or her results. For support in relation to module assessment and progression, please contact the Assess and Progress helpline. The email address is asksusu@tcd.ie or phone extension 4400. This concludes another podcast from the Genesis Project team.